No rain, a child must die. No sun, a warrior must fall. That was the law of the gods. For the Aztecs, sacrifice was not an act of cruelty. It was a sacred obligation, the foundation of life itself. In a universe that had already died 4 times, where suns had fallen and worlds had crumbled, the 5th sun, the world we inhabit, was only kept alive through offerings of blood. Not metaphorical blood, real human blood. Sacrifice was not just a ritual. It was survival. On the highest step of the Templo Mayor, beneath the unforgiving sky, a priest raised an obsidian blade. The heart he held was still beating. Below him, thousands watched, not with horror but with reverence. The drums did not signal death. They signaled order, rhythm, purpose. That man on the stone was not a victim. He was chosen, marked by fate. To die in this way was not punishment, it was a return. The Aztecs had a word for it, nextlahuali. It means to pay a debt, and that was the essence of it all. The gods had bled to make the world. Now the world had to bleed to keep them strong. The story begins before humans, before time even. When the gods gathered in Teotihuacan to create a new sun after the last had perished, 2 stepped forward. One was proud, wealthy, powerful. The other was disfigured, humble, diseased, Nanahuatzin. But when the moment came, the proud hesitated. Nanahuatzin jumped into the fire. He gave himself without fear, and the sun was born. Yet the sun would not move. It hung in place, lifeless. And so, one by one, the other gods followed. They cut themselves open. They gave their hearts. Only then did the sun begin to travel across the sky. The message was clear. The universe moves forward only when blood is given freely. From this sacrifice of the gods themselves came the deepest law of existence. Humanity was born into debt. Every Aztec ceremony, every offering, every cut, every drop, it was all repayment. To live another day, to see another sunrise, the balance had to be maintained. This was not cruelty. This was cosmic accounting. The sun rose because someone gave their life. The rain fell because children had wept and died. The crops grew because warriors spilled their blood in ritual combat. To outsiders, especially to the Spaniards, this looked like madness. But what they failed to see was the worldview underneath. The Aztecs did not worship gods in heaven, far away and silent. Their gods walked among them. And those needs were not optional. They were law. Natural law. Divine law. A law older than stone, written in blood, etched into the cycles of the sun and moon. This is where we begin. Not with myth, but with meaning. Not with judgment, but with understanding. Because once you see the gods the way the Aztecs saw them, you begin to realize something startling. They didn't kill for pleasure, they killed to keep the sky from falling. Before the first crop could grow, someone had to bleed. Before the first battle could be won, someone had to die, not in combat but on an altar. In the Aztec worldview, the universe itself was built not with tools or words, but with pain, surrender, and sacrifice. It was not a metaphor. It was memory. The world existed because the gods had given everything. Their creation story tells of 5 suns, 5 worlds that came and went. The first was destroyed by jaguars, the second by wind, the third by fire, the fourth by flood. Each era ended in disaster. Each one was a failed attempt, until the gods gathered once more to try again. But this time they understood something. For the 5th sun to live, something greater had to be offered. They met in the sacred city of Teotihuacan, and the gods asked, "Who will become the new sun?" One god was wealthy, noble, confident, Tecusistecatl. The other was Nanahuatzin, poor, sick, humble. Both were to throw themselves into the fire. But when the moment came, Ixiptla hesitated. He stepped back. Huitzin, covered in boils and scars, walked into the flames without pause. He gave himself entirely. The sky lit up. The new sun appeared. But it did not move. It stood still in the heavens, shining but frozen. The other gods realized the sun alone is not enough. Motion requires more. Light must be powered by blood. So they all followed. One by one, they sacrificed themselves. Only then did the sun begin its path across the sky. From that moment on, a divine law was established. Sacrifice is the source of movement. Without it, the cosmos stalls. The sun stops. The rain vanishes. The world begins to collapse. The Aztecs were not guessing. They were remembering. They saw the blood in the soil, in the stars, in the tides. They believed their ancestors were not only people, they were fuel. The fifth sun, the one we live in today, was not born naturally. It was bought at the cost of divine life. That debt passed to humanity. And to the Aztecs, to refuse sacrifice was not only impiety, it was rebellion against the order of the universe. So they gave. Warriors taken in battle. Children with tears painted on their faces. Priests who pierced their own ears, tongues, genitals. Mothers who offered their sons. Kings who cut themselves before planting season. Blood did not pollute. Blood purified. It was the bridge between earth and heaven. Even time itself obeyed this logic. The sacred calendar, the tonal pohueli, was a map of divine needs. Every day carried its own gods, its own expectations, its own ritual obligations. Some days demanded rest. Others demanded war. Some were lucky. Others were soaked in omen and dread. No action was neutral. No moment was without consequence. In this sacred rhythm, sacrifice was not occasional. It was constant. It was woven into the very fabric of existence. When the sun rose, it did so on blood. When the corn grew, it grew from sacrifice. When the empire expanded, it expanded through death, but death with meaning, death with purpose. They did not kill recklessly. They killed responsibly. Because for the Aztecs, the greatest fear was not dying. It was imbalance, cosmic collapse, the return of darkness. And the only thing that held it back was the human heart, offered freely, placed in divine hands. This is how they saw the world. Not as cruel, but as sacred. Not as broken, but as demanding. And every demand, every ritual, every sacrifice, they all pointed back to the same truth. The world was built on blood, and blood was the only way to keep it alive. He was born in blood, covered in feathers, armed from the moment he opened his eyes. Huitzilopochtli was not just a god of war. He was war itself. Not abstract strategy or distant glory, but immediate, necessary, burning violence. And through him, the Mexica, later known as the Aztecs, found their identity, their mission, and their divine permission to conquer. His birth is one of the most violent stories in Aztec mythology. His mother, Huitzilopochtli, the earth goddess, became pregnant after a ball of feathers entered her womb. Her other children, the stars and the moon, furious and ashamed, plotted to kill her. But just as they attacked, Huitzilopochtli was born fully grown, painted in blue, holding a serpent-shaped weapon and wearing hummingbird feathers on his head. He slaughtered his siblings, casting the moon to the sky, scattering the stars. This myth was more than a story. It was a cosmic justification. The sun, represented by Huitzilopochtli, must fight the darkness every single day. And just as he had destroyed the moon and stars, he would need constant strength to rise again and again. That strength, of course, came from human blood. The Aztecs believed they were his chosen people. According to legend, Huitzilopochtli spoke directly to their leaders, guiding them during their long migration from Aztlan. He led them through deserts, valleys, and rival territories, always promising one thing: that when they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent, they would know they had reached their promised land. They found that sign on a swampy island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. There, they built Tenochtitlan, destined to become one of the most powerful cities in the world. And at its heart, towering over the streets and canals, stood the Templo Mayor. One side of the temple was dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain. The other to Huitzilopochtli. War and agriculture. Blood and water. Survival and conquest. The balance of life. Huitzilopochtli demanded sacrifice not only in ritual, but on the battlefield. Warfare was sacred. It was not driven by greed or power. It was religious duty. The Aztecs didn't wage war to destroy their enemies. They waged war to capture them. Because captives meant offerings, and offerings meant life. This gave rise to the Flower Wars, ritualized battles arranged not to win territory, but to gather warriors for sacrifice. It may seem strange, but for the Aztecs, there was no greater death than one given in war or ritual. Dying for Huitzilopochtli meant eternal life in the sun. The fallen warriors would rise each morning with him, accompany him across the sky, and return again the next day. Even the empire's political structure was built on this ideology. Each conquest, each tribute, each act of expansion, everything was offered in his name. He was not just a patron god. He was the blueprint of empire, the reason for their rise, and the fuel of their ambition. But he was also a reminder of fragility. The sun needed strength. Without sacrifice, it could weaken. And so the Aztecs never stopped moving, never stopped fighting, never stopped feeding the sky with hearts and blood. Their victories were not celebrations. They were obligations. Through Huitzilopochtli, the Mexica justified their hunger for dominance. But they also carried a heavy burden. To be chosen by the god of war was not just an honor. It was a sentence, a promise of endless struggle, a vow never to rest. And so, day after day, under the watchful eyes of their blue-skinned god, they sharpened their blades, marched into battle, climbed the steps of the temple, and gave everything so that the sun would rise again. Not all sacrifices were for war. Not all gods were warriors. Some demanded something gentler, but in the Aztec world, gentleness still came with a price. Tlaloc, the god of rain, ruled over water, fertility, and agricultural abundance. His name brought hope to farmers and fear to children. Because the storms he brought could save a harvest or destroy a village. And the rituals that pleased him often required the smallest and most innocent of lives. Tlaloc was one of the oldest gods in Mesoamerica, worshipped long before the rise of the Mexica. His image appears in Teotihuacan, in the temples of the Toltecs, and in the sacred mountain traditions of the Central Valleys. He was easily recognizable, goggle eyes, fangs, and a mask shaped like rain clouds. But behind that almost comical face was the power of life and death. Because water is both giver and taker. Without it, crops fail. With too much, floods come. His moods shaped empires. The Aztecs believed that Tlaloc lived in the mountains, and that each peak housed spirits known as Tlaloc, minor gods of rain who carried jugs of water. When pleased, they poured gentle showers. When angered, they hurled storms, hail, and lightning. Appeasing them was not a symbolic gesture, it was agricultural survival. Entire seasons depended on their favor. And so they offered sacrifices, but not of warriors or criminals. Tlaloc preferred something else, the tears of children. Each year during the festival of Atlcahulo, children were chosen, often healthy, beautiful, and young. They were dressed in ceremonial garments, adorned with paper crowns and necklaces of green maize. They were honored, comforted, even celebrated. But then they were taken to mountain shrines, where they were killed. The priests watched for a sign. If the children cried before death, it meant Tlaloc was pleased. Their tears were seen as mirrors of the rain itself, soft, sacred, essential. To us, it may seem unthinkable. But to the Aztecs, it was the most sincere form of devotion. Giving what was most precious. Offering innocence to ensure survival. The fields demanded it. The gods demanded it. And the people obeyed, not with joy but with reverence. Tlaloc's temple stood beside Huitzilopochtli's atop the Templo Mayor. War and rain side by side. Blood and water eternally intertwined. The Aztecs understood the balance. You cannot conquer without food. You cannot feed your armies without crops. And you cannot grow crops without rain. But Tlaloc was not only feared. He was also a promise. Those who drowned or died by lightning were believed to enter his paradise, Tlalocan, a lush, eternal spring filled with flowers, music, and endless water. It was one of the few afterlives not tied to sacrifice or valor, but to the beauty and chaos of nature itself. Through Tlaloc, the Aztecs remembered that life did not come from power alone. It came from softness, from growth, from elements outside human control. But even softness had its rules. Even fertility required tears. And so, just as they sharpened their blades for war, they prepared their offerings for rain. Because without Tlaloc, the earth would dry, the people would starve, and the gods would turn away. And in a world built on balance, no god, no matter how gentle, could ever be ignored. He wore feathers, not armor. He brought knowledge, not war. He created rather than destroyed. In a pantheon soaked in blood and fire, Quetzalcoatl stood apart, not in opposition to the other gods, but as a reminder that divinity could also mean wisdom, wind, and mercy. His name meant feathered serpent, and his presence was a paradox, serpent of the earth, bird of the sky. Movement and stillness. Breath and stone. To the Aztecs, he was a creator god, one who had shaped the first humans out of bones stolen from the underworld. In the ancient myth, Quetzalcoatl descended into Mictlan, the land of the dead, to recover the remnants of previous worlds. The lord of the underworld challenged him, tricked him, and broke the bones. But Quetzalcoatl gathered them anyway, mixed them with his own blood, and formed the new race of humankind. This act was not violent. It was sacrificial in a different way. Quetzalcoatl gave of himself, not by destroying others, but by bending the rules of death. He bled not to kill, but to give life. And so he became associated not only with creation, but with the breath of existence itself: wind, knowledge, healing, music. He was the patron of priests, scholars, and artisans, the god of calendars, books, and sacred learning. Temples built in his honor were less intimidating than those of Huitzilopochtli. They were spaces for contemplation, not conquest. Offerings to him included butterflies, jade, and incense, not just blood. But even he had his downfall. One of the most enduring myths tells of how Quetzalcoatl, once a great priest-king, was tricked by the dark god Tezcatlipoca into becoming drunk and committing a sin. Some say lust, others say pride. Ashamed, he fled east, vowing to return one day and reclaim his place. This story planted the seed of a legend, that Quetzalcoatl would one day come back, bringing with him a new era. And when the Spanish arrived, pale-skinned and bearded, sailing from the east, some believed the prophecy was fulfilled. Whether or not this belief truly shaped Montezuma's decisions is debated, But the idea itself reveals something crucial. Quetzalcoatl was not forgotten. He was expected. In him, the Aztecs projected their hope. A god who could create without destroying, who could lead without conquering, who could restore balance without demanding endless blood. But this hope did not erase the other gods. It stood beside them, like light beside shadow. Quetzalcoatl did not cancel war or sacrifice or law. He offered an alternative rhythm, a slower beat in the middle of thunder. And though his temples did not drip with blood, his name remained carved in the stones of the empire, because even in a world ruled by knives, there is space for breath. And so, among gods of fire and rain, among temples built to feed the sun and drown the fields, there rose the feathered serpent, gliding between earth and sky, carrying the memory of what humanity could be and the promise of what it might become. Not every god shouted. Some whispered, and those whispers still echo in stone. The Aztecs did not build temples to touch the heavens. They built them to recreate them. To walk up the steps of a pyramid was to ascend the structure of the universe. To enter a sanctuary was to stand at the center of creation. Their architecture was not just symbolic, it was cosmological. Every angle, every level, every color and material echoed a spiritual order. The temples were not merely places of worship. They were maps. At the heart of Tenochtitlan rose the Templo Mayor, the most sacred structure in the Aztec world. But to understand its meaning, one had to see through Aztec eyes. The dual staircase at its front was not a design choice. It was a declaration. On one side, the stairs led to the shrine of Tlaloc, the god of rain. On the other, to the shrine of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war. Each god represented one half of the sacred cycle: nourishment and conquest, sustenance and struggle. Together, they maintained the balance that held the world in place. But the temple also represented something deeper: the mythic mountain of creation, Coatepec, the hill of the serpent. According to legend, it was there that Huitzilopochtli was born in battle, slaying his siblings to defend his mother. And so, every ritual atop the Templo Mayor reenacted that moment. Every sacrifice was a return to the beginning. Every drop of blood was a thread, stitching the present to the mythic past. This cosmic logic extended beyond the capital. Aztec temples across the empire followed sacred alignments. Some were built to face the rising sun on the equinox. Others marked the solstice. They tracked Venus, counted lunar phases, and echoed the patterns of constellations. For Aztec priests, to build a temple was to inscribe time into stone. The sacred geography did not stop at the base of the pyramid. Beneath Tenochtitlan, canals flowed like veins. Causeways stretched across the lake like arteries. The entire city was designed as a microcosm. The four cardinal directions, each associated with specific colors, gods, and rituals, radiated outward from the center like the points of a celestial compass. Even the journey up the steps was ritualized. To climb was not simply to approach the divine. It was to reenact the ascent of the soul, the rise of the sun, the motion of the cosmos itself. At the top, in full view of the heavens, life and death met face to face. Offerings were made, bodies fell, and the gods were fed. These temples were not inert structures. They breathed. They remembered. They embodied the Aztec conviction that space was sacred, and that every stone, if placed correctly, could mirror the divine. In this world, nothing was neutral. Architecture itself became theology. Engineering became cosmology. And through this sacred design, the Aztecs didn't just worship the universe. They recreated it, piece by piece, step by step, heart by heart. Their temples were not built to last. They were built to repeat. because creation, like the sun, must always begin again. The Aztecs did not ask what time it was. They asked what kind of time it was. Because for them, time was alive. It had personality. It was not linear but cyclical, repeating, pulsing, returning like the seasons, like breath. And most importantly, it was sacred. Every day was not just a date. It was a destiny. They used not one but two calendars. The first, the tonal Pohuali, counted 260 days. It was the sacred calendar, used to divine fate and choose the proper moment for rituals, marriages, naming, travel, or war. It combined 20-day signs, like wind, jaguar, reed, and flint, with 13 sacred numbers, producing a cycle that was both mathematically elegant and spiritually charged. No 2 days were the same, and none repeated for months. The second calendar, the Ziu Pohuali, was the solar calendar, 365 days divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus a final, ominous 5-day period called the Nemontemi. Those last days were seen as empty, dangerous, uncertain. People avoided work, stayed indoors, and waited for the cycle to begin again. Time, after all, could break. Together, these two calendars interlocked like gears in a cosmic machine, forming a 52-year cycle known as the bundled years. When the calendars aligned at the end of a cycle, the Aztecs held the most important ceremony of all, the new fire ceremony. It was a ritual of fear and hope. All fires across the empire were extinguished. Darkness covered the land. People destroyed possessions, broke pottery, fasted in silence. Priests climbed the hill of the star, near present-day Iztapalapa. There they watched the sky. If the Pleiades crossed the zenith at midnight, it meant the world would continue. If not, it meant the gods had withdrawn, and the sun would never rise again. When the stars aligned, the priests ignited a new fire inside the chest of a sacrificial victim. That flame was carried across the empire to relight hearths, temples, and lives. The cycle had been renewed. The debt had been paid for now. This ritual reminds us that the Aztecs did not see time as guaranteed. It was a fragile thing, always at risk. And only devotion, sacrifice, and perfect timing could hold it together. The priests who read the calendars were not just scholars. They were engineers of fate, astrologers of eternity, guardians of balance. Every child was born under a specific sign. That sign shaped their name, their character, even their profession. A child born on one wind might become a priest. One born on 7 flint might become a warrior. But nothing was random. The calendar whispered divine intention into every life. And because the gods themselves were bound by time, the Aztecs believed that knowing the calendar meant knowing the will of the gods. To act outside of it was to invite chaos. To act within it was to flow with the very rhythm of creation. In this way, the Aztecs not only watched time, they obeyed it, honored it, measured it with precision and awe. Because to them, time was not the backdrop of life. Time was life, and the calendar was its heartbeat. Blood was not just a substance. It was energy, currency, communication. The Aztecs saw it as the very essence of life, not only for humans, but for the universe itself. Without it, the sun could not move, the rain could not fall, the crops could not grow. Blood was not symbolic. It was fuel. And to spill, it was not simply to die. It was to participate in the most sacred exchange imaginable. From the moment a child was born, the idea of sacrifice was never far. Infants had their umbilical cords buried with symbolic tools, a miniature shield for a boy, a spindle for a girl. It was a way of saying, your life will be lived in service. Service to your family, your city, your gods. And ultimately, if fate allowed it, your blood. There were many types of offerings. Not all required death. Priests performed auto-sacrifice daily, piercing their earlobes, tongues, and genitals with obsidian blades or bone needles. The blood collected was offered in bowls, smeared on idols, or burned with incense. These rituals were silent conversations with the gods. To bleed was to speak. To hurt was to connect. But the highest form of sacrifice was the offering of a human heart. The heart was seen as the seat of the Tana, the personal energy that connected each individual to the cosmos. When a heart was removed, still warm and beating, it was not discarded. It was lifted to the sky, offered to the sun, placed inside the mouth of a stone idol, or buried in sacred ground. The body was often cast down the temple steps, not with contempt, but with theatrical reverence. A final gesture in a divine performance. The victims were not always captives. Some were chosen, trained, revered. A man selected to impersonate a god, such as Huitzilopochtli, would live for a year in luxury, adored and worshipped. He would walk the city wearing jewels, playing music, smoking fine tobacco. And at the end of that year, he would climb the steps of the temple, break his flutes, and offer himself to the knife. To become a god was to die like one. Warriors aspired to die in battle or to be taken alive for sacrifice. Women who died in childbirth were equated with fallen warriors. Both were believed to accompany the sun in its dangerous journey through the underworld, protecting it from the forces of darkness. Their sacrifice ensured not just survival, but cosmic order. From the outside, this may seem horrific. But to the Aztecs, sacrifice was not a spectacle. It was necessity. The gods had created the world through their own pain and destruction. Now humans, in turn, sustained it through theirs. This was not brutality. It was reciprocity. A divine contract signed in blood, renewed with every pulse. Even festivals followed this logic. During Ixiptla, the flaying of men, captured warriors were sacrificed, and their skins were worn by priests. This was not mockery, it was transference. Life, power, and memory passing from one body to another. The ritual was not meant to erase the dead. It was meant to carry them forward. In modern eyes, it is difficult to grasp. But for the Aztecs, it was not death that was terrifying. It was emptiness, forgetfulness, disconnection, and the sacred flow of blood prevented that. It nourished the god, sealed the calendar, held the sky in place. Because for them, the greatest tragedy was not to die. The greatest tragedy was a sunless dawn, a hungry god, a silent temple. And so they gave their hearts, not to end life but to keep life moving. The line between mortal and divine was never fixed. For the Aztecs, gods were not distant forces locked in the sky or buried in forgotten myth. They were near, and sometimes they wore human skin. In the most sacred rituals, gods did not merely receive offerings. They inhabited bodies. They stepped down from the heavens, not through visions or symbols, but through living men and women chosen to become them. These were not impersonators. They were Ixiptla, representation, but also in a deeper sense incarnation. To be an Ixiptla was not a punishment. It was an honor. Those chosen were carefully selected, nourished, trained, adorned. A young man chosen to embody Huitzilopochtli would live an entire year as the god. He would wear his jewels, walk with his authority, speak with his voice. Women bowed before him. Nobles feasted him. Children looked at him and saw a divine face. But he always knew how it would end. When the calendar cycle completed, the god would be led through the city one final time. He would play his flute, break it on the temple steps, and lie down on the stone. His body would be opened, his heart lifted, his blood offered to the sky. And in that moment of death, he was no longer a man pretending to be a god. He was the god returning home. This logic extended beyond individual Ixiptla. During major festivals, multiple figures would be dressed and adorned as deities. In the ceremony of Huitzilopochtli, young girls might embody maize goddesses, their hair dyed yellow like ripe corn. In Pre-Columbian, warriors carried banners of Huitzilopochtli, marching not as soldiers, but as extensions of his will. Even statues were treated as living beings. They were bathed, dressed, given food and drink. Not because the Aztecs were superstitious, but because the divine was real, and anything that bore its shape deserved care. The idol was not a symbol, it was a vessel. And vessels, once filled, had to be respected. This closeness to the divine shaped every layer of Aztec society. Priests were not mediators, but channels. Kings did not just rule by divine right. They were themselves semi-divine, chosen through omens and rituals, guarded by cosmic law. Every action, from market trade to childbirth, existed under the gaze of gods who could step into the world at any moment. There was awe in this, but also terror. Because if a god could walk among men, then no place was safe from judgment. A mistake was not just a personal error. It could offend a god standing beside you in disguise. And so, devotion had to be constant. Rituals were not empty performances. They were negotiations with powers that listened, watched, and sometimes entered the room. The gods walked among them, not in dreams, not in metaphor, but in footsteps on stone, in voices through masks, in blood flowing from chests lifted to the sun. And if the gods could take flesh, then every body, every face might be divine. When the Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, they did not bring gods. They brought steel, disease, and fire. But to the Aztecs, the moment had already been foretold. For years, omens had shaken the empire, flames in the sky, rivers of blood, the cry of a woman in the night warning that the end had come. And so when strangers arrived from the east, pale-skinned and bearded, the question was not, who are they? The question was, is this the God who promised to return? Some say Montezuma believed Hanun Katuz was Quetzalcoatl returned. Others argue this is a myth invented later. But what matters is not the historical detail, it's the spiritual dissonance. The Aztecs looked at the conquistadors and saw prophecy. The Spanish looked at the Aztecs and saw demons. They saw the temples as abominations, the sacrifices as barbarism, the idols as false gods. They burned codices, toppled pyramids, and silenced the voices of stone. But in doing so, they failed to understand what the Aztecs truly were. Not savages but mystics. Not butchers but believers. Theirs was a faith so deep, so structured, so alive, that it guided every breath, every step, every war, every calendar, every drop of blood. And when Tenochtitlan finally fell, its streets drowned not only in blood but in misunderstanding. A world ended. Not just politically, cosmically. The temples stopped bleeding. The sun no longer had a heart. The gods went silent. But silence does not mean death. In the mountains and fields, among the Nehya people, the old stories were whispered still, hidden in song, in dance, in ceremony. The gods survived, transformed, waiting. And now, centuries later, their echoes rise again, not in conquest but in curiosity, in the hunger to understand, to look beyond the ruins and rediscover the vision that once moved an entire civilization. Because to understand the gods of the Aztecs is not just to understand their religion. It is to understand their world. A world where time was sacred, where the sun needed blood, where sacrifice was a language and temples were living maps. A world built not on cruelty, but on cosmic balance. And in learning their stories, we are reminded of our own. What do we worship? What do we offer? What do we sacrifice, and for whom? If this journey through the Aztec soul has moved you, challenged you, or awakened something deeper, we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe not just to this channel, but to the pursuit of wisdom buried in forgotten places, because some gods never die. They are simply waiting to be remembered.